I have been invited to participate in the seminar exploring the topic of contextualizing the self, making and remaking the first person in various religious traditions and from diverse methodological perspectives. The specific task set before me was to lecture on this theme as it pertains to the construction of the divine self in Kabbalistic teaching. Needless to say, this is a vast topic about which hundreds of pages have been written. In this lecture, I can only offer a modest attempt to share some of my own thoughts that have evolved in the span of almost 4 decades. Methodologically, I approach the question as a philosopher, not as an intellectual historian. However, as is always the case in my scholarship, the philosophical perspective is informed by historical context. We pick up our story in the 12th and 13th centuries, when Kabbalah began to emerge as a clearly identifiable phenomenon in Provence and northern Spain. Bracketing the conviction uniformly expressed by adepts and even by some scholars that the esoteric teachings were transmitted either orally or partially in writing for centuries before being transcribed more fully in written text. A process referred to recently in a somewhat confusing way as the repressive de-sublimation of rabbinic esotericism. The late Middle Ages is still the time that we can legitimately identify as the advent of Kabbalah on the stage of history. The rabbinic elite of this period, and it should be emphasized that Kabbalists either were members of that socioeconomic class or were in close proximity to the academies and synagogues imbued with its ideology. At this period, the rabbinic elite increasingly accepted the portrayal of God as unknowable and ineffable, a description heavily influenced by the apophaticism embraced by medieval Jewish philosophers, the most prominent of them being Moses Maimonides, but at odds with the cataphatic emphasis of the scriptural and rabbinic corpora.
Could you just explain what apophatic and cataphatic is?
So, these are technical terms from Greek philosophy which come to mean the cataphasis, that's positive attribution, or the description of positive characteristics. So God is wise, God is good, God is true, God is just. Apophatic or apophasis is the negative. It's literally speaking away. So it's the argument, it's the premise that we cannot speak positively about the nature of the divine, so that anything we say has to be at best understood as the denial of a negation. Good? Okay. So, as I was saying, by the time the Kabbalah emerged, the rabbinic elite more or less has accepted the view that the God of Judaism, even though the biblical and rabbinic corpora would suggest differently, is a God that is unknowable and ineffable. As Maimonides explicitly argues in The Guide of the Perplexed, the ultimate apprehension of God consists of apprehending that we cannot apprehend God. Insofar as this supreme what he would have considered the supreme metaphysical knowledge is the lack of knowledge, it follows that the most appropriate form of prayer, as he says quite explicitly, is silence, quoting Psalms. And what he calls towards the end of the guide, the intellectual worship of the heart. Since any imagistic depiction of what is inherently without image, even if it is only verbal, is susceptible of allotting into idolatry. Indeed, even uttering praise of the inability to praise God may run the risk of affirming too much about the being from whom all perceptible and intelligible properties are to be expunged. Now, the roots for this negative theology are in Platonism and especially in the Neoplatonic schools of late antiquity. But since some of the works that arose from there were translated and transmitted in the name of Aristotle, the best known example is the so-called theology of Aristotle, which consists of selections from Plotinus's Aeneid, it is fair to say that the Aristotelianism cultivated by medieval Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers, at least until the 13th century, was tainted by Neoplatonism. Now, for our purposes, the most significant ramification of this intellectual hybridity, this putting together Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, was this fusion of the apophasis and cataphasis in the way that God is demarcated, or as God is typically called in philosophical literature, the first cause, or in Maimonides' term based on Ibn Sina, the mechuyav ha'metziut, the necessary of existence, referred to as the hyper being, or the being that is beyond being, the being that transcends all predication. And so the technical Greek term that's at play here is hyperousios, which was coined by the pseudo-Dionysius. And in that expression, hyperousios, the prefix hyper connotes both the being that is beyond, and therefore conceptually indescribable, and the being that is above, and therefore metaphysically superlative. The logic of apophasis at its extreme leads to the proposition that nothing that is asserted about God can be taken as literally true. And if we stretch this to its limit, we cannot even ascribe existence to this being, to which neither being nor non-being can be properly attributed. And we find that some of the Kabbalists by the end of the 13th century actually do use the expression lo yesh lo ayin in order to refer to either Keter or to Ein Sof. Lo yesh lo ayin. But to probe the nature of the divine theology, the Kabbalistic theosophy, we must begin with an appreciation of this central role accorded to the apophatic. The climax of the contemplative ascent, to use the idiom attributed to the Provençal Kabbalist Isaac of Lyme, consists of thought cleaving to that which thought cannot comprehend. The expression machshavah be'ka is used by his disciples to refer to this, to the aliyat machshavah, the dekut of the machshavah, to the machshavah in maseged. The thought cleaves to that which thought cannot comprehend. A state of devekut facilitated by the mind divesting itself of all concepts, images, and words. Some Kabbalists even went so far as to identify the goal of the mystical path as devekut be'Ein Sof, as conjunction with the infinite. In this non-dual consciousness, or if you will, meta-consciousness, the consciousness that is beyond consciousness, all differentiation is overcome, and the suitability of language is called into question. As we find in the case of visionaries in other religious communities influenced by this apophasis or this via negativa, the apophasis voiced by Kabbalists engenders what could be simply called a mystical atheism that renders all theistic portrayals of God, including the theosophy promulgated by the Kabbalists themselves, as conceptual idolatry. This would lend credence to Franz Rosenzweig's comment in the Star of Redemption that the fundamental idea of negative theology culminates with atheism. And it culminates with atheism and mysticism shaking hands. Or as Derrida put it, and I quote, like a certain mysticism, apophatic discourse has always been suspected of atheism. Elsewhere, Derrida states that the atheistic quality of Jewish esotericism relates more specifically to the indeterminacy of meaning, a hallmark of his deconstructionist hermeneutics, but it also signals the subversion of monotheism insofar as the personal descriptions of God are reduced to images that are factually false. Now, to be sure, in Kabbalistic sources, the apophatic dimension is counterbalanced by an amplification of the cataphatic predication of the biblical and rabbinic corpora. With respect to this matter, there is a chord between Kabbalah and the mystical piety fostered by Christians and Muslims. In all three monotheistic faiths, informed by their respective scriptural legacies, the language germane to the visionary gnosis of the divine ensues from the juxtaposition of the cataphatic and the apophatic. That is to say, the very being to whom the disparate forms are ascribed is the being from whom those forms are erased. The mystical utterance, consequently, is a gesture of speaking not rather than not speaking, an unsaying of the said and the saying of the unsaid, once we can deduce that there is no end to speaking when what is spoken is the unspeakable. That's why you find Kabbalists right more and more and more and more. They don't adopt vows of silence, either with respect to speaking or writing. And Afila Tanit HaDibur, even the Tanit HaDibur, which of course is a technical rabbinic category, even the Tanit HaDibur requires certain tefillot, or the utterance of tehillim. So you don't have a model of complete withdrawal from verbal articulation. Okay, then I'll skip a little bit here. Again, to come back to my point that I was making before, if one follows the logic of this derech shlila, or the via negativa, to its limit, one is led to the unsettling realization that monotheism is in truth, or at least in its mystical truth, atheism. Or, alternatively expressed, the aniconic corollary of the monotheistic creed occasions the undoing and demythologization of theism. To bring it back specifically to Kabbalistic symbolism. Assuming that Ein Sof is beyond all description, then any positive statement of belief would be an apophatic gesture of unbelief. Indeed, in some sense, the crumbling of the cornerstone of monotheism. Since one would have to believe in the representation of God that one could not believe in, on the grounds that they are illusory appearances of what is, in fact, inapparent, or that which cannot appear, that which cannot be manifest, that which is concealment as such. Now, the atheistic tendency to go beyond the portrayal of the divine develops from and remains dialectically intertwined with its theistic underpinning. So the unraveling of the latter necessarily brings about the nullification of the former. Or if I wanted to use Meister Eckhart's celebrated formula, to free God from God requires that the Godhead beyond God, that is Ein Sof, be liberated from any delimitation of godliness that is not subject to an uncompromising and seemingly never-ending denegation. The hermeneutical postulate underlying this claim is that to overcome is not to deny or to destroy, but to surpass, which entails constant delineation of the limit that one perpetually exceeds. The surpassing invariably secures the threshold that has been surpassed. Maybe one of the most succinct formulations of what I'm getting at was offered by a Kabbalist who was active at the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, Yitzchak Yaakov, who reports in his mystical diary, the Otzar Chaim, that he received from his master, who goes unnamed, that the goal of contemplation is to reach a state of dveikut with the Ein Sof, which he says is beyond name, the nameless. But the only way to achieve that is al derech hasulam shehu Hashem HaMeforash, The only way to achieve the equity with the Ein Sof, that is the nameless, is through the name, which is the latter. So here I think we come face to face with the paradox that informs the Kabbalistic worldview. The namelessness of the infinite, whose hidden truth is beyond comprehension and verbalization, can be revealed only by constricting its luminal darkness in the spiritual light of the four letters of the ineffable name, the Shem HaMeforash, also called the Shem HaEtzem, the essential name, since it comprises the essence of Ein Sof, but in essence, that is essentially without essence. It's an essence that is the absence of essence. So let me briefly recall here a discussion of Sholem, which will cast some of my own insights into sharper relief. So in his study, Shir Koma, the mystical shape of the Godhead, Sholem noted that, quote, crucial for the metaphysics of the Kabbalah is the belief that, quote, the formless substance of Ein Sof is immediately present in its full reality in all stages of emanation and creation. Whence it follows that, quote, there is no thoroughly shaped image that can completely detach itself from the depths of the formless. What Sholem is getting at here is that so the immanence of the formless in every form yield the fundamental paradox. And this is how Sholem enunciates that paradox. The truer the form, the more powerful the life of the formless within it. To delve into the abyss of formlessness is no less absurd an undertaking for the Kabbalists than to ascend to the form itself. The mystical nihilism that destroys any shape dwells hand in hand with the prudent moderation struggling to comprehend that shape. The attentive ear will discern in these words what is a basic tenet in Sholem's approach to mysticism. And that is that the mystical experience is an encounter with the absolute or infinite, what he refers to here as the shapeless abyss. And thus, to the extent that the formlessness threatens to undermine the forms imparted by the text and reified by the rituals of a particular tradition, the experience is potentially nihilistic. Now here I would depart a little bit with Sholem with regard to the language of nihilism. I would look at this from a slightly different perspective, but I do agree with Sholem that there is this paradoxical, or what he would more typically refer to as a kind of dialectical intertwining of formlessness and form. And again, as I said before, to me this is a characteristic that is not unique to the Kabbalists, but is shared also by Christian and Muslim mystics in the Middle Ages, in the European continent, in large measure due to the influence of that Neoplatonic legacy. And this, additionally, I will add, from the point of view of hermeneutical point of view, it relates also to another paradox which has been central to my thinking, which also echoes an insight of Sholem, and that concerns the inability to separate concealment and disclosure. Right? And the 16th century Kabbalists in Tzfat formulated this as a principle. You find it in Al-Shif and in Vital, Cordovero, also one text that's attributed to the Ari, and that is Ha'helem Sibat HaGilui, HaGilui Sibat HaHelem. Right? So that the concealment is the cause of disclosure, and disclosure is the cause of concealment, which essentially means you cannot really separate those two. But there's some kind of paradoxical identity of these opposites. Okay, so I'm going to skip here a discussion about Walter Benjamin, which I think is interesting, but maybe I'll have a little Rahmanut. I don't say it there. But it is interesting, and it's important to actually understand Shalom and his reading of Torah.
Just explain more than you think needs explanation.
Yeah. Well, then we'll be here beyond my flight, etc. So, maybe it would have been best to circulate the paper. All right, I'll try to do my best to get to simplify as much as I can. Okay, so I'm going to skip this whole discussion of Benjamin, which I said is interesting, but I will skip it. So let me go pick it up again at this point. Coupled with this insight regarding the formlessness or the namelessness of the Ein Sof, whose light is manifest in the form of the 10 Sefirot, which collectively are the Shem Farash. Right? There is also the very strong emphasis in the Kabbalistic literature on the contemplative task of visualizing the invisible through the image of the human form. And according to a recurrent exegesis in Kabbalistic literature, Adam is linked philologically to the expression Edamel Elyon in Isaiah 14:14, which read Kabbalistically means that there is a theosophic grounding to the priestly notion that the human being bears the likeness and image of the divine. So in contrast to the scriptural derivation of Adam itself from the term Adamah, which obviously relates to our transient and earthly character, this mystical wordplay places superiority on the human species, and this is limited more prototypically in the people of Israel, in the fact that the human shape iconically mirrors the body of God. So all of this is going on at the same time that the Kabbalists are accepting that the Ein Sof is beyond all representation. Okay, so this positive characterization of Adam having been created in God's image and somehow related to the physical nature of Adam and not simply the psychic or the spiritual, this is predicated on the presumption of some kind of correspondence between the limbs of the human body and what they thought of as the limbs of the divine body, or the spherotic emanations. Another verse that is typically cited by the Kabbalists to support this correspondence is from Job, Mi B'sari Echazeh Eloha, which they read very literally, I would even say hyper-literally, that is, from the body, from the bodily flesh, one can visualize, one can envision, one can see the contours of the divine body. Now, of course, it goes without saying that no Kabbalist, at least none with whom I am familiar, presuming that the divine body should be understood literally as if God were a fleshly being subject to generation and corruption, birth and death. But it is also clear that no Kabbalist could accept the philosophical view that these expressions are merely allegorical. So the ascription of a body to God is not simply a rhetorical device to express the inherent metaphoricity of theological language. And here too I would say that Sholem rightly noted that the medieval theology dictated by philosophers quote, sought to push the biblical concept of monotheism to its utmost extreme, and even outdid the Bible itself in removing any vestiges therein of mythical or anthropomorphic parlance. In the newly evolving Kabbalah, we find the opposite tendency. Here too, the spiritualization of the idea of God is accepted, fact, but the ancient images re-emerged, albeit now with symbolic character. And it goes on to say, unlike the philosophers, the Kabbalists were not ashamed of these images. On the contrary, they saw in them the repositories of divine mysteries. So here too, I walked in the footsteps of Sholem, but I would say that I have a slightly different perspective than Sholem, in that I try to provide a model that goes between the literal and the allegorical, or the figurative. And that's what I refer to my work as the imaginal body. So I think of the body of the divine as the imaginal body, not the imaginative body, but the imaginal body, which is a term that I borrow from the work of Henri Corbin on Islamic esotericism. In order to convey this sense of embodiment that is not material flesh, but is nevertheless a concrete phenomena and not merely a figure of speech. Anyhow, again, I'm gonna shorten my presentation here because I have a feeling that it's maybe a little bit too difficult to follow me, and maybe with Adam's response, he'll open up things, and then I'll have a chance to elaborate on some of my ideas here. But I would say the main point that I'm trying to get at here is that the divine self assumes a corporeal form in the imagination of the visionary. But of course, the interesting thing is that the visionary who can imagine the divine body is someone who has achieved through ascetic practices a divesting of corporeality. And we have then the tension in the literature between the apophatic tendency with its emphasis on the unknowable formlessness, and then the more cataphatic tendency related to the visionary or contemplative necessity to form an image of the divine in the imagination that is itself been divested of corporeality. So this notion of the imaginal body suggests that the Kabbalists, in a rather sophisticated way, for their time, for the historical time, and I think this has stood out across the generations, have offered us a very unusual idea of embodiment. Right? So that even our embodiment, our mortal flesh, is transformed by this Kabbalistic notion that the true nature of embodiment is connected to letter. And more specifically, of course, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which are all thought to be comprised within the Shema Mefarash. So that the ultimate signifier of embodiment for the Kabbalists is the name of the nameless. And just as the name is the ladder by which one ascends to and is integrated within the nameless, right, so the conjuring of the form of the divine in the imagination is the means by which one ascends to contemplatively and is ultimately incorporated into the formless. So I would say, mercifully coming towards the end, that the Kabbalistic approach confirms what I would call the final gesture of iconoclasm in Jewish monotheism, because it calls for the destroying the idol of the very God, personified as the deity that must be worshipped without being idolized. Now let me support this idea by mentioning Rav Kook. In accord with the Rambam, Rav Kook was sensitive to the fact that the theistic renderings of God are idolatrous. The way we pray to God, the way we imagine God, typically, Rav Kook says without any hesitation, are in fact idolatrous. As he puts it in one passage, he says that the ikar ha'emunah, the essence of faith, is the gedulat shleimut ein sof. That's the ultimate measure of emunah, gedulat shleimut ein sof. And thus, whatever we imagine in our hearts about God, he says, is a glimmer that must be completely obliterated, batel legamre, when viewed against what really exists, which is the Or Ein Sof, the light of Ein Sof. And he goes on to say that every name we assign to the Ein Sof is, quote, but a small and dim spark from the hidden light to which the soul aspires when it utters the word Elohim. Every definition of divinity brings about kafirah. Say that again. Every definition of divinity brings about kafirah. Every definition is Eliyut Ruchanit, which I translate here as spiritual idolatry. Even the attribution of the intellect and the will, and even divinity, Elohut itself, for Elohim is a definition. All, what Rav Kook was saying here is all positive God talk. By the way, this is retrievable from the Shmona Kvatzim, where we finally heard the words of Rav Kook without the editorial hand of the Nazir or Tzvi Yehuda Kook. So this is a very strong. There are other passages like this here that obviously I can't share them all here because it wasn't a lecture of Kook. But I think I chose the good one because there's no ambiguity. All positive God engenders kfirah. But at the deepest level, the kfirah is the unfaith for Rav Kook that is indistinguishable from faith. And now let me say these words again. With regard to the supernal divine truth, there is no difference at all between the conceived belief and heresy. Heresy, too, is the disclosure of the force of life, for the light of life of the supernal splendor is garbed within it. Okay, so the way I'm understanding of Kook here is that the theistic representations are, he acknowledges, explanations that bring us to the source of faith. But these explanations can have the opposite effect of diminishing one's spiritual vitality. In fact, it goes on to say that the Matzor Gadol, the greatest impediment of the human spirit, is to achieve maturity such that, let me say it again, the greatest impediment of the human spirit to achieving maturity is that the Machshava Elohit becomes fixed as a particular form. But the ascendancy of atheism in time that precedes the messianic emancipation, according to Rav Kook, is viewed as a constructive light, as the repudiation of the belief that is necessary, quote, to eliminate the dross that has clung to the faith because of the dearth of knowledge that is worship. So I think you got the point. That the function of atheism for Rav Kook is to remove these surot hamiyuchadot from our conception of divinity and to uproot the klipa that separates the human from the true divine light. And then he says that klipat ha'akshama ha'achrona hadaka that must be destroyed consists of yachas ha'mitziut v'chalut el Elohut.
What does that mean?
It's everything I've been trying to say. It means to get to the point where
Horns on cell.
Huh?
Horns on cell.
To get to the point that even to say of this Ein Sof that it exists is too tzimtzum. It's too tzimtzum. So it's to get beyond tzimtzum, effectively. To get to the state of harchava or hitpashtut, expansiveness of consciousness that would go beyond even referring to the existence of God. Okay, so maybe I'll end here. But so just to bring it into some kind of closure. So what I was trying to get at here is that what Rav Kook articulated in the 20th century is the culmination, and I think, by the way, greatly influenced by Chabad, but it is a culmination of thinking that began in earnest in the 13th century with the new Kabbalah. And it's a path that, was clearly discernible where it would go. But it is to get us to a point where the very activity of personifying the divine is to lead us to what I've called the depersonification, to get us beyond, and that has a corresponding, I think Adam is going to elaborate on this, this would have a corresponding psychological dimension, which would be the divesting of our own ego self, which would correspond to this process.
Okay, I think this, thank you, Elliot. This raises a lot of questions. Among other things, what Elliot focused on was the impersonal aspects of God. Whereas in fact, in many ways, God, once you go beyond Ein Sof, once you go beyond the pure essence of God, which is indeed apophatic, cannot be understood, cannot be said, cannot be uttered, then God has, in fact, persons. He has more than one person. In fact, he has 10 persons. So the Sephirot have their own characteristics, their own histories, their own sexualities, their own gender. All of these things, I think, we would like to ask you and hear from you about, as in some ways, I think, this characterizes what is special about Judaism, because the apophatic aspects, in fact, are Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, and that aspect, I think, including the most daring statements that you like Cook's, you can find in other places. Whereas Sfirat Keter or Sfirat Malchut, that you cannot find, at least not one-to-one, in other places. At least we can talk about this. Our respondent is Professor Adam Afterman. Professor Adam Afterman is chair of the Department of Jewish Philosophy and Torah.
So we just heard a very rich presentation. I'll be focusing in my written response on some aspects, and then we can probably talk about our aspects later on when we open up for discussion. So I'm extremely grateful to Professor Aviad Kleinberg for inviting me to respond to Professor Wolfson's presentation. It is a welcome opportunity and an appropriate occasion to express once again my deep admiration of Elliot and his scholarship. This workshop was a great platform for me personally to delve once again into some of his recent thought and work. In the weeks leading to this workshop, I had the opportunity to reread some of Elliot's main studies regarding the self and God. However, due to the time restrictions, I'll be primarily referencing his paper that we just heard today. What I'd like to focus here is, after such an eloquent presentation, is into the overlap of Elliot's methods and conclusions regarding the divine, non-persona, and my, and actually his, long-established interest in the matters of religious transformation, integrative mysticism, Bikut and mystical union from the perspective of the human self. He engaged this topic both in a deep and articulate manner, and I would like to highlight his very interesting understanding of the Godhead and the divine self, and the ultimate mystical fusion between it and the human self in the movement of Unia Mystica. Before I delve into the question of what exactly happens or does not happen in the moment of fusion of the human self and the Godhead, I would like to pause and consider the stages leading to Elliot's presentation of the divine self. And I'll just go over a few of the basic stages I think we heard today. Then with these stages in mind, I'll advance toward a possible understanding of the human self, and ultimately ask what kind of mystical integration is possible between the two. As we just heard, in Kabbalistic literature following Sefer Yetzirah, one finds a hyper-linguistic conception of reality in which all being, including the human being, and even, we just heard, the human body, is a linguistic manifestation of the divine name, whose essence is the concealed Godhead. Consequently, there is a fundamental ontological connection, or an organic isomorphic extension that exists between the human individual and the Godhead. As previously mentioned, the impact of Neoplatonic via negativa of Maimonides and other philosophers impact the way the Kabbalists portrayed God. In this philosophical strand, they imagined God as unknowable and ineffable. This tendency was intertwined, as we just heard, with the conflicting biblical and rabbinic positive emphasis on figural representation of God, and ultimately the fundamental assumption that God is to be related to as a persona, as a name, in some sort of intimacy. Transcending his wisdom, his light, and private name lies the dark light, what Elliot just referred to as the luminal darkness, that is somehow at the same time the root of God's light and the human candle, the human self. Before going into the complicated question of how Wolfson views the Godhead and the divine self, we just heard a presentation. I would like to first refer to Sholem to better understand the two basic ways of understanding the Godhead in the scholarship of Kabbalah up until Elliot, and their implications for the understanding of the human self and mystical transformation. Elliot himself, in a very important essay, Annihilating Non-Ground on the Temporal Sway of Becoming, cites himself Sholem's true understanding of the Godhead in his 10 Unhistorical Aphorisms on Kabbalah. This is a classic text on this topic, which he identified in Zoharic literature and Luriani Kabbalah. There's two ways to view this problem. Regarding the former, Sholem wrote, "One might well ascribe the early Kabbalists' pantheistic identification of Ein Sof and nothingness to their own real experience. The mystic who treats his experience undialectically must end up in pantheism." And for Sholem, we know pantheism is a very negative attribute or conception. We remember Yosef ben Shlomo, they wrote about the fear, or the fear of pantheism. That's something that's haunting the scholarship of Jewish mysticism from the beginning.
Just explain what pantheism is.
Pantheism in this context is ultimately the theory that God in existence or all reality is one, and human and God is one, and there's no small difference or some kind of categorical difference between God as the creator and the universe. And Sholem, following Amon Cohen and other thinkers, viewed that as an untheistic understanding of God. He felt that the Kabbalists were always, that was a kind of categorical borderline of heresy that they couldn't pass. They were like on the border of that all the time, and always keeping them, at least when they're talking and expressing their experiences, they always are very careful not to express and go all the way to pantheistic theories. So he said, if you identify Ein and Ein Sof, ultimately you reach an untheistic understanding of the Godhead, and Elliot just talked about that from one aspect. Here Sholem concludes that the identification of Ein Sof with Ein, rooted in mystical experience, and here we're coming into the psychological, the personal aspect. People experience this. It's not only a theological move. Ultimately leads to a form of pantheism in which no distinction can be made between the divine and creation.
And that's an extremely anti-theistic notion in his view. We should bear in mind that this pantheism is exactly what allows for mystical fusion of unia mystica to take place. Thus, pantheism and unia mystica for Sholem exists beyond the parameters of theistic Judaism. We know he was against both pantheism and against unia mystica. This is already, we already, I think, in the Jewish scholarship of Jewish mysticism, already overcome a lot of this in recent years, and my book is also about that. Regarding the later conception, Sholem writes that Luria's conception of Tzimtzum allows for a distinction to be made between the Godhead and nothingness, thereby placing the Ein Sof on a separate ontological plane. Thus, Luria, Arik, writes that he guards against the danger of dissolution into the non-individual being of the divine all in all. In Sholem's eyes, the language of Vikut, and not union, reflects exactly this tension, a form of mystical integration that does not lead one to full annihilation into the Godhead. Doesn't bring you to full bitul, into the Ein Sof. That's safeguarding God's transcendence and avoiding pantheism. So these are the two options by Sholem. Now I'm going to say a word about Elliot's third alternative discourse. And he offers an alternative discourse regarding the nothingness of the infinite. He does not, this is, I hope I understand it right, Elliot. Wolfson does not agree with Sholem's assertion that the options are either nihilistic pantheism, in which the Godhead is identified with being, or a theistic mysticism in which the Godhead is understood as a transcendent being beyond being. Wolfson's third way of viewing the Godhead, one in which the Godhead is conceived as beyond being, similar to Luria's description, but at the same time as a form of nothingness, as found in Sholem's analysis of the Zoharic conception. So this may best be articulated actually in a quote that I'll just quote from Elliot's paper. We heard something of this before. The nothingness of infinity to which the Kabbalists allude is not a substance subject to the antinomy of existence and non-existence, but rather the dynamic event, and this is very important, it's an event, of the immanent transcendence, that is the transcendent immanence. That is the event wherein transcendence and immanence are juxtaposed in the sameness of their difference, prior to the division into transcendence and immanence, dictated by the logic of traditional onto-theology. Okay, you wrote that, and you explained that in different words just earlier. This point where this nothingness is something that's beyond the categories of regular existence and non-existence. Therefore, I think the big chidush of Elliot is that he proposed that Ein Sof is outside the structure altogether of negative theology. As he said, God, or the Ein Sof, is an absolute that does not signify an unknowable one, but rather the manifold, that is the pleuromorphic bias, or nothingness, that's being's core. The negation devoid of the negation of its negation, or a triple negativity. The emptiness of the fullness, that is the fullness of emptiness, emptied of the emptiness of its emptiness. Now I know this sounds a bit thing, but we're trying to express in words, or I think Elliot is trying to express in words in a poetic way, perhaps, this form of Ein Sof that's beyond Ein and Yesh, some kind of category that's beyond, and I think once you get used to this kind of discourse, it actually makes sense. I can in this conception, to speak of the Godhead as something is just as mistaken as to speak of it as nothing. For it is both, because it's neither. It's neither the Godhead itself, the Ein Sof itself, is neither something or nothing. It's something that transcends that. Okay. Like I mentioned in his paper, Elliot mainly focused on the divine self, and he was invited to talk about the divine self. And I'm going to move and say a few words about the implication for the conception of the human self. And the human psychological and mystical transformation that's linked to this. Since man is ontologically connected in different ways to the Godhead, mystical transformation and integration, including mystical union, are forms of realization of a pre-existent unity. I mentioned that the human self should be conceived as a linguistic manifestation of the divine name, and as such, the movement towards the divine may be considered as a form of realization or embodiment of the tetragrammaton in the human, that of becoming one with the name, or with the divine light and wisdom that are considered embodied inside the name. And we just heard different articulations of this dynamics, but now we're talking about the human dynamics. The human is also, like you said about Adam, the human is structured out of the divine name, and the same process is parallel inside the human. This movement of realization of the human inside the name is a movement of bitul, of iyun b'ivrit, yeah, iyun b'bitul. So that the person has to get rid of the false self, that would be the ego or some other form of a name, a false name, and realize his true name. The true name, the true self is God's self. And then we reach a very complicated moment where realizing your true self in God is reaching this point where God's self is at the same time a name and what transcends that name. Okay, and I'll say a few words about that now, about this movement. So the first move would be, like I said, the realization or the embodiment of the divine name in the human, that becoming one with the name. This is a positive type of una mystica. The human realizing its core being is shared or is one with the divine being. However, since the divine name, whose essence, or in fact in essence, is the concealed Godhead, man's being is also to be understood as beyond being and non-being, and as non-substantial with the Godhead itself, because God himself is beyond his being, beyond his name, so becoming one with God is a parallel move beyond. Here referring to a union that occurs beyond the name, light, or intellect of both the human and divine agents. And we just heard before that some Kabbalists identify the goal of the mystical path as conjunction, dvikut, with the infinite. However, like I said, the question is how one should understand mystical transformation in such a setting. If both the Godhead and the human self are ultimately nothingness, or this form of nothingness beyond nothingness, how does mystical transformation and mystical union take part, or how does it actually happen in history? The movement from yesh to ayin, and from ayin to Ein Sof, whereupon the yesh is understood as the same other, or the original repetition of that which has already been. And this is where some of, I think, Heidegger's thought is coming into Wolfson's analysis. In this consciousness, the yesh is considered as the ultimate revelation, the name of the ultimate concealment. However, due to the nature of this concealment, what is disclosed is the concealment, for the concealment cannot be disclosed as concealment unless it's concealed. And this is this paradox that Elliot just talked about of Elem and Gilui. Since this conception of the Godhead is meontological in nature, meaning that it's infinite, there's an infinite kind of chasm or chalukah, in which opposites converge at the point of their origin, this mystical transformation of coming towards the ultimate union does not only affect the soul, but even the body as well. We just heard about this theory from Elliot. The somatic body is transformed into a semiotic one, into a permutation of the name. The material becomes textual, and ultimately man becomes one with the divine name. As Wolfson said, stated, so I'm not going to quote that now. For this understanding, in the void of the infinite, the material is the spiritual, and the spiritual is the material. And the ultimate goal of the mystical goal is to cleave to the nameless. The only way to achieve that end, however, is through the union or the realization of the union as a name, which is a ladder. We just heard about the name in the Sulam. However, as Wolfson continued, one can never dispose of the ladder because the name is not only the means by which one ascends to the nameless, it is it's the adventure by which the nameless is declaimed and thereby remains inexpressible. Okay, so this name has to stay there. You can't go beyond the name. You have to have the name all the time, at the same time with the nameless. So I'm just going to complete with one more remark about what happens, and I hope Elliot could be generous enough to talk about that a bit more in public, about how he understands this moment of fusion itself, of the self, the human self, Ani, with this form of Godhead. Okay? We see, I would like to suggest, and here I'm very careful, that the moment of mystical union with the absolute nothingness, which is more than nothing, and therefore less than nothing, is to transcend the binary model of union and communion, or this distinction between the name and nothingness, in which one's essence, that means the human essence, and here we're not talking about a union that erases not the humans, but also not the name of God. So we're talking about a very complicated moment, or movement, or event. I think that's the word to use, event, in which God is united inside himself, and then the human is participating in the same kind of dynamics in this event where he's at the same time transcendent and at the same time embodied, or same time embodied in the name, embodied in the body. At this point, the body, you kind of hinted at that, the body is not the regular body, it's the name. So the human becomes the name, and the name at the same time is fused with the Ein Sof. So we're talking about a very interesting event where they're both kind of in this final state, not as a singular moment of final illumination, but rather as a perpetual dynamic. It's never fully realized. This is a movement, and we're used to Eastern kind of categories of thought where union brings us to a moment of absolute illumination, absolute, final absolute integration. This is an event that continues. For the moment it is realized, it begins again. The running and returning of Vatzov Shov, and that's the image I think best used to talk about this dynamics, this event. Vatzov Shov, which is itself the event of union, is a union beyond union. So that's, I just wanted to kind of bring that to a more hinted kind of point about the mystical union. I hope Elliot will be willing to say a few more words about that in our discussion. Thank you very much.